Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to today's edition of Read TFOS, where I take old stories I've narrated and update them to modern audio standards. This particular story is part of a series, a 6-part series, and this is part 5. I hope that you enjoy. The Impossible Part 5. Broodmother Zanya, second of the 3 broodmothers chosen to lead the assault on Prometheus, felt glee ripple through her systems as she watched the human ships torn to shreds and the might of the hive fleets. There would be no need for additional offspring created specifically to destroy humans. No need for close study and tactics. She knew some of her sisters would harbor sadness, regret even, in the moment of victory. But as one of the oldest broodmothers, Zanya had long accepted the inevitable. The Grand Queen was the ultimate ruler of their race, and she demanded conquest. Why shouldn't she seek joy in fulfilling her purpose? It would be a short war. The human ships had hulls made of some unknown material, harder than anything the brood had on record. Each required a concentrated effort to breach, but they were vastly outnumbered, and their behavior. The 800 human ships had moved to engage the brood armada the moment they had walked in. Then they had proceeded to take careful shots with guided projectile weapons at the brood ships, clearly aiming for engines and weapon systems. They were trying not to destroy. Zanya scoffed. Naive humans. How could they have a war fleet and yet be so soft? They were wasting their already limited fleet on suicide runs in the least efficient way possible in order to avoid harming their enemies. Precise shots on a moving target are far more intense than a simple barrage of hull-melting plasma. Coordinated focus between the human ships had successfully disabled several brood ships, but it was costing 2 destroyed human ships for every 1 disabled brood vessel. And when they were outnumbered more than 12 to 1, it was a foregone conclusion. After the skirmish, a fraction of the brood fleet was disabled, not a single Skalai casualty. They would be able to recover the lost ships, repair the damage, and have the crew back in fighting shape in no time. Meanwhile, the human fleet was obliterated. Despite the wholehearted acceptance of the fact, Zanya couldn't help but feel a pang at the loss. If each of the human ships had 100 crew, it was 80,000 sentient creatures they had just massacred. It didn't help that she could feel a familiar wave of despair flowing out from Taris and a tired resignation from broodmother Naya. She forced the sentiment from her heart and pushed forward. The station was next, then they could scavenge for the data that would lead them to the human homeworld. What? 800 ships were drifting towards them from Prometheus. Human ships exactly like the ones they had just destroyed. Sheer deja vu made Zanya briefly scan the wreckage of the fleet the brood had just obliterated. It was all still there. These ships were just reinforcements. Taris's reports did mention the humans had some space warping technology. Were these ships hiding in some kind of dimensional pocket, a hidden emergency reserve of fighting power? Perhaps the humans could present a threat after all. Those thoughts were steadily banished as the new fleet did exactly what the same as the last, taking careful, disabling shots on brood ships at the expense of massive losses as the sustained barrage from the fleet overcame the heavy hull plating and turned each human ship into melted metal. Another easy victory. Then 800 more arrived. They were still winning. They would hold an ultimate advantage as long as humanity continued its self-sacrificial ploy to disable the brood ships without causing casualties. But broodmother Naya couldn't help but feel uneasy. The number of human casualties was staggering now, yet the ships kept coming. But from where? She directed her long-range sensors to a point above Prometheus, sensing not only the visible ultraviolet rays reflected from the slim gaps of radiance that escaped the human sun sphere, but all across the spectrum of light. Then she saw it, a point of glowing light in space above the station, and from it emerged metal. It was metal in shape, a hull emerging in space, the edges rough. Human machines swarmed over it, doing something. Hundreds, no, thousands of them. Then in less than a single minute, a new ship was just there. The engines ignited, and it fell into formation with its sisters, preparing to move into the battlefield. What was this? What was she seeing? Where were these ships coming from? How were they doing this? The sight was so bizarre, so alien, that Naya almost missed something equally significant she should have been aware of immediately. There was a single brood scout ship landed in the station itself. Its sensors and crew were not responding to any standard channels. That must be the Zydus. The ship had been gutted. It was in two distinct pieces, and bits of it were missing. Most crucially, the warp drive. Brood Mother Naya had no mouth that could frown, but it would have been. She submitted a report to the Grand Queen. If she could not figure out this conundrum, then no one could. Station Prometheus Alpha, in orbit around Material World Prometheus, observing the Sagan Dyson sphere around Juliana 6. Everyone here in the control room at heart of Prometheus Alpha, Commander Church and his staff, Dr. Reyes, the Premier and her ministers, watching as human ships were destroyed by hundreds. It was going perfectly. The rate at which they were making ships was slow for now, cautious. Project Genesis was still very much in its infancy, and necessity had forced them to go from barely working to a very late-stage project in very little time. The equivalent of trying to send a man into space a few weeks after the Wright brothers had achieved their first flight. Humanity had known since Einstein's time that matter and energy were two sides of the same coin. The nuclear bomb was the very real evidence of that. The energy of the very small amount of matter producing a titanic quantity of energy. Simulations had proven that the opposites were achievable in theory, something the boys in the lab called the reverse nuke, tongue firmly in cheek, but the cost was prohibitive. The amount of energy in a single kilogram of matter was sufficient to produce a 50-megaton explosion. Generating even a few grams of matter required the kind of power that the entire human race could survive on for centuries. The entire concept was a wild theory. Play physics, something a professor in a university might explain to his students as a curiosity of science. Until Sagan had been completed. The power drawn from the Dyson sphere made energy a non-issue. They had as much as they could ever need and more. There was room enough to experiment. In orbit above Prometheus, Dr. Reyes had witnessed the first instance of matter being created from nothing but energy. Something from nothing. Genesis. A preloaded ship design using a carbon lattice for its hull that had previously only existed in theory and was suggested to be impossible to manufacture traditionally, was loaded into the station computers. Then hundreds of years of additive engineering experience let humanity make it happen. A drone ship made from nothing. The process was far from perfect. Every single ship required a small army of drones reshaping parts of its hull. Pieces of its internal systems had to be stitched together the old-fashioned way. Far too intricate for the matter creation process. But they had more than enough drones. It was working. Now they had forced exactly what they wanted to happen, a war of attrition, because at the moment, humanity could not possibly lose one. If it took 2 human ships to harmlessly disable a single brood warship, then humanity could and would spawn 10 for every enemy ship on the field. Commander Church couldn't keep the smile of relief off his face as he watched everything go down. There was so much that could have gone wrong. He tapped one of the eggheads on the shoulder as he worked. "Okay, let's pick up the pace a little." The egghead met Church's grin with one of his own. "Yes, sir." Somehow, impossibly, without warning or reason, the brood fleet was outnumbered. Brood Mother Zanya could feel the surge of panic that reflected off her sisters like an echo chamber of discord before the Grand Queen stomped it out. Space was so littered with the corpses of destroyed human ships that the wreckages were making navigation difficult. A full half of the brood fleet had been disabled and now hung in space, helpless. A retreat at this point would mean leaving a staggering quantity of resources lost in space for the humans to claim. But they had little choice. Almost 100,000 human ships swarmed the brood now, 10 times the size of the original armada, moving with mechanical synchronization, powering through waves of seething plasma to calmly plink away at the brood ship's weapon systems and engines. This was impossible. No tactics were sufficient against this kind of overwhelming numerical difference. Zanya felt the chilling sensation of being on the wrong side of a swarm for the first time in her very, very long life. The order came through from the Grand Queen for the brood mothers to retreat. Drones were replaceable as long as the brood mothers lived. More could be produced. Even the 150,000 odd crew members of the 10,000-strong brood armada attacking. They had expected some kind of superweapon attack, a giant solar phenomenon turned against them, a laser with the power of a star that obliterated ships perhaps. Not this enormous wave of suicidal warships. The brood mothers gave a command to the drone fleets to flee, if possible, then turned themselves around and activated their warp drives. The Grand Queen began to draw up new plans. Station Prometheus Alpha, in orbit around Material World Prometheus, observing the Sagan-Dyson sphere around Julianus 6. Applause erupted in the control room. Total victory, with 0 casualties on either side, they hoped. If the warships were anything like the Zydus, then the disabling of the guns and weapons on the Sky Fleet should have not killed any living creatures. Every shot had been made with careful computerized precision. The AI under the directive not to fire a shot unless conditions were absolutely flawless. All right. Give me a status on the warp engine transfer. Church spoke above the chorus of cheering. Just hooking up the last components, Commander. Techs say that they will be ready for the test run in 20 minutes. Church smiled, adding numbers in his head even as the cheering died down in the control room to be replaced with excited conversation. How long did Captain say that one of those warships could sustain a crew for when dead in water? About 5 months, sir. Good. None of over the 5,000 ships now floating in space would kill any of their crew before the war was over. Keep 6,000 drone ships around the disabled fleet, just in case. Let's finish up our little war, shall we? End of chapter. I would just like to thank the T5 supporters. Bushmaster 117, Caspar Arnholtz, Draxoon WRE, Elijah Silvercross, Gray, John Carrington, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.